By late 2001, the Imperial Japanese forces remained locked in a multi-year stalemate against the Beta incursion upon their homeland. Owing to the success of 1999's Operation Lucifer, UN troops would see an increased presence in Japan through the establishment of the Yokohama base. This research facility, built on top of the hollowed-out husk of a former Beta hive, had played a key role in facilitating the safe return of the Japanese head of state during the recent 12/5 incident. Having gained a limited window of stability, Shogun Kōbu Yuhi had been able to maintain increased sovereignty over Japan. From November through mid-December, skirmishes against the Beta took place in both Niigata and Yokohama. Against these attacks, the IJF, alongside the United Nations, firmly held the line. Thus, Japan was soon better able to help facilitate UN efforts in launching a counterattack against the nearby Sadogashima hive. Preparations were finally made for the eventual attempt to push the invaders out of the country once and for all. Objective 21 had provided the Beta with a firm foothold from which to strangle the Japanese people. Hives were their strongholds, built deep into the earth. They held a central chamber containing a reactor powered by unknown means, connected to multiple branches of tunnel networks ever expanding around its territory. On the surface, the Beta would erect intensely durable structures known to researchers as a monument, while the tunnels below, known as the stab, were accessed across the surface by various entry points referred to as gates. As the stab grew, so too would the monument, where such stages in growth were classified into phases. IJF and UN commanders knew that if the hive were allowed to progress into its sixth stage of development, its estimated stab would then extend beneath Niigata and reach as far as Fukushima Prefecture. This would allow the Beta to bypass the extensive defense lines on the surface and simply emerge behind the Japanese military in force. Time, in the coming decades, would be acting against the IJF. An attack on the hive would be no simple endeavor. At Phase 4 in development, the shores of Sadogashima were teeming with heavy laser class and fort class Beta, as well as an estimated population size no less than 100,000. Not only had no hive capture operation ever been met with success through the use of conventional tactics, but the island itself was a natural fortress, and the Beta occupied its every corner, above and below. Attempting to capture Sado Island would cost a massive amount of the UN and IJF's resources. Manpower and ammunition stores across the entirety of the Far East Front would be required, as Objective 21 remained the most critical sector therein. While UN Pacific Command was eager to see the region stabilized at last, failure of the operation would likely cripple humanity's means to defend Japan in the event of a Beta counterattack. In order to give their forces an edge, UN researchers and commanders at Yokohama base had spent years devising multiple experimental means by which to ultimately turn the tide against the Beta. By October of 2001, a revolutionary new operating system for TSFs had entered its proof-of-concept stage, with field tests demonstrating its ability to raise pilot survival and combat effectiveness through increasing TSF maneuverability by 30%. This was the XM3 operating system, developed by officers at Yokohama and widely sought after once combat data proved the success of its design. Combat field testing for the XM3 had occurred during the 12/5 incident, where UN flights responsible for the combat actions on the Izu Peninsula were equipped with the prototype system. Rookie pilots in the 207th flight were able to survive without losses against far more experienced and numerous IJA rebels. The 9th Squadron of the UN Special Task Force A-01, otherwise known as the Valkyries, were able to fend off multiple waves of rebel TSFs. The XM-3 would see further combat testing on December 10th during a skirmish against the Beta outside Yokohama base. While it could not be fully implemented in their militaries until the following years, both the Japanese Empire and the United States understood the degree to which XM-3 would enhance their TSF forces. As a result, both nations expressed interest in its acquisition. The developers were Japanese personnel under the employ of the UN, stationed at Yokohama base. They would easily provide the XM-3 to the Empire, who in turn had already intended to provide the bulk of military forces for the Sadogashima operation. The Americans, in order to acquire the XM-3 for their military as well, would offer a vital exchange in technology. They would provide the Yokohama base with the research and prototypes of a defunct military project known as the High Maneuver Aeronautic Fortress. The HIMARF was a US-backed program originally developed by the North Americana, McDonnell Douglas, and Lockheed Defense Companies. It had been intended to create a large-scale mobile fortress capable of assaulting Beta hives directly. Its weapon system and means of propulsion made use of experimental technology derived from element Gray, a highly classified Beta resource simply referred to as G-elements. Designated as the XG-70, two models of the HIMARF were provided to the UN, an early model known as the B variant, alongside the more fully developed D variant. Both machines were powered by a Moorcock-Lecta drive, a resource-intensive engine which utilized G-elements in order to generate lift by the manipulation of gravitational fields. As a result, the immediate airspace around these floating fortresses was a distorted pocket of gravity known as a Rutherford field. When powered, this field was capable of deflecting laser irradiation, as well as tearing apart any substance which came into contact with the XG-70. The platform's main weapon was a charged particle cannon, also powered by the ML drive and its G elements, which only the US and Yokohama base had in sufficient quantities. Development of the weapon was hampered in the 1980s, when the onboard crew was killed by a gravity anomaly during its initial test flight. Unable to safely man the mobile fortress, it was then designed only to be used by an onboard computer. Though the project had long been cancelled, its reactivation was requested under the purview of the UN, who redesignated the HIMARF as the Susanoo. By late 2001, the XG-70B Susanoo Mark II was a fully automated aerial superweapon, ready for deployment by the UN. The much larger XG-70D Susanoo Mark IV would remain in the deep confines of Yokohama base, where American and Japanese engineers were hard at work assembling its components and developing a means by which to nullify the Rutherford field's fatal effects upon the crew. With operation of the XG-70B being fatal to any crew placed within, and with the XG-70D's planned capabilities for safely manned flight still in development, in order to deploy the superweapon, researchers at Yokohama base had been hard at work developing a computer system known only as the 00 unit. This was intended for installation aboard the floating fortress, allowing for automated use on the battlefield. Little is known about the design and appearance of the highly classified 00 unit, but its creation was due to the central role it played in the UN-based research program known as Alternative 4. The Alternative programs were a series of research projects undertaken by the United Nations in order to determine a solution to the beta threat. Its first 3 iterations had been designed around attempts to study and communicate with the beta, none of which had seen success. Alternative 4 relied upon this advanced computer system, designed by one Professor Kozuki Yuko of the UN 11th Force. The 00 unit, with the XG-70 as its body, was intended to make contact with and destroy the beta. Deployment of the XG-70 and evaluation of its performance in battle was the driving force behind the UN's desire to participate in the operation to recapture Sadogashima. In contrast, a majority of representatives in the United States created and backed a separate program known as Alternative 5. Their proponents advocated for the extensive use of the experimental US-developed G-bomb over the entirety of Eurasia and its occupant hives. For the UN forces, most of which were formed from personnel of nations hoping to reclaim their lost territory, the use of such weapons of mass destruction risked the likely consequence of devastating Eurasia beyond preservation. As much as the looming operation would be a battle to finally drive the beta from the shores of Japan, it would also serve as a battle between the 2 concurrent alternative programs and the viabilities of each. The UN Pacific Command's 11th Force, its power consolidated through its extensive efforts to support the Empire of Japan, would make use of the technology available at its Yokohama base for the sake of Alternative 4. The XG-70 would serve as its hive-busting tactical aeronautic fortress. The 00 unit would serve as the weapon's central processing computer, and the XM3 operating system would be installed on board its accompanying escort TSFs. In the United States, meanwhile, the supporters of Alternative 5 stood ready to move forward with strategies of implementing worldwide deployment of G-bombs should the former approach prove ineffective. In late December, military forces began gathering off the western shores of Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy would contribute their highly experienced combined fleet, with overall command of the operation being given to Admiral Ozawa Hisaya. Ozawa and many of his captains had been present on the day of Sadogashima's fall, and had long since awaited the day their ships would return to the island. IJN units would be responsible for securing the shoreline and providing indirect fire support during the entirety of their mission. Ozawa's flagship would be the heavy cruiser Mogami, from which Operation Headquarters would be located. The Imperial Japanese Army would be given the task of landing upon the western end of Sado Island. Accordingly, Headquarters would designate their force as Whiskey Unit. Whiskey would consist of 4 armor divisions and 10 tactical armor regiments. As well as the IJA, the elite 16th Guard Battalion of the Imperial Royal Guard would be deployed in the Whiskey sector as well. The United Nations would contribute forces from all across the Far East Front, alongside the entirety of their Pacific Fleet, and the 6th Orbital Drop Corps as well. UN forces would be tasked with securing the eastern end of the island, receiving the designation Echo Unit. Echo would comprise 3 armor regiments and 5 tactical armor regiments. The Pacific Fleet brought an immense amount of firepower to the battle in the form of 5 American battleships: the USS Iowa, USS Kentucky, USS New Jersey, USS Missouri, and the USS Illinois, as well as the vessels of their accompanying battle groups. To supplement the UN fleet, the IJN battleships Yamato and Musashi would also deploy in support of the landings at Echo. Whiskey and Echo units would serve as diversionary forces to allow the operation's 2 linchpin units to assault the Hive. The first of these critical elements was the UN 6 Orbital Drop Corps, which consisted of 2 tactical armor regiments, approximating 200 TSFs in total. Should they fail to capture the Hive by conventional means, the secondary element would be the XG-70B. Hive capture operations were always conducted as joint military efforts, more often than not with extensive reliance on UN support. Orbital troops were a vital part of the pre-established tactics required for such missions, and the only organizations in possession of such forces were the US and the UN. Orbital divers were elite surface pilots, trained to infiltrate and neutralize Beta Hives through the use of high-velocity re-entry shells dropped over a battlefield from orbit. Piloting F-15C Eagles and F-15E Strike Eagles, these personnel were the best of the best, and their role of driving deep into the underground bowels of a Beta Hive often meant they suffered high casualties with each drop. Popular theory among their ranks holds that no orbital diver is statistically capable of surviving a 3rd drop. The re-entry shells used by orbital divers function not only as a means of transport to the battlefield, but as both shielding and screening from laser fire, and as high-velocity kinetic munitions in their own right. They were deployed from space-borne destroyers known as hyper-surface shuttle transports. Along with the standard cargo transport roles and the aforementioned delivery of orbital troops, HSSTs were also utilized as space-borne bombers, deploying re-entry shells packed with anti-laser MRV warheads. These capabilities would be brought to bear on the enemy through the inclusion of the orbital troops. And so, the joint Japan-UN effort in leading a counterattack was done so in high hopes that it would be the first step in turning the tides of the war and allowing humanity as a whole to go on the offensive at last. By December 23rd, details of the operation were announced to their respective forces, who had already gathered at predetermined assembly points in the Sea of Japan. Despite the key role played by the Yokohama base, they would only be committing a single TSF squadron to escort the Susanoo Mark II. The UN Special Task Force A-01's 9th Squadron was an elite unit of all-female surface pilots, aptly known as the Valkyries. Originally formed to conduct missions in support of Alternative 4 objectives, this task force had been significantly reduced from its original numbers, where multiple elite squadrons had comprised a total of 108 TSFs, a full regiment. But due to the high rates of attrition, the task force now only consisted of the Valkyrie Squadron, which fell under the command of Surface Pilot Ace, Captain Isumi Michiru. On December 24th, at 0400 hours, the STF A-01 departed from Yokohama base, transporting their TSFs to Takata base in Joitsu. From there, they embarked aboard the TSF carrier Osumi and proceeded to rendezvous with the Echo landing force. By the evening, all fleets had moved into position around the island. With Christmas Day set as the scheduled day of the attack, countless soldiers remained restless aboard the ships. No Hive capture operation had ever succeeded by conventional means, and only one had ever been successfully captured due to the G-bomb. Casualty rates were expected to be high, and initial stages of the battle relied upon establishing the main forces of Whiskey and Echo as diversionary units intended to endure the main assaults of the Beta. Even the Hive Infiltration Strike Force, now assembled in orbit, understood that TSFs had never successfully fought their way into the main reactor of an active beta hive. But there was no turning back. On December 25th, at 0856 hours, Operation 21st commenced. In orbit, a fleet of HSST destroyers began the first phase of the operation. Detaching their re-entry shells, the descending capsules deployed in low Earth orbit and separated into multiple anti-laser warheads over the island. Sadogashima, still teeming with hundreds of laser and heavy laser class, erupted in pillars of laser fire, intercepting the MRV ordnance with pinpoint accuracy. This had the desired effect, as the anti-laser munitions reacted with the laser irradiation, causing explosions of heavy metal clouds to blanket the skies over the island. With the clouds now decreasing the output from the laser strains, follow-on bombardment pushed further down through the intercepting fire. The IJN Combined Fleet's 2nd Squadron, under the command of Captain Abe Tomohiko aboard the Shinano, initiated an intensive saturation attack against the Kawaharada coastline. Firing anti-laser shells from their battleship cannons, they achieved the same results of the orbital strike, adding to the clouds of heavy metal blanketing the island. Once the cloud density was sufficient, the IJN vessels switched to standard, multi-purpose munitions and began hammering the beta with impunity. The amount of firepower used for the saturation attacks would require 50% of the entire ammunition reserves of the IJF and the UN Far East forces. In the opening salvos alone, the IJN fired nearly 3/4 of the ammunition it brought to the battle, suppressing the beta along the southwestern coastline. Dozens of heavy laser class, however, were still active further inland. With the naval bombardment ongoing, the landings were initiated by the IJN Marine Corps. Under the surface of Mano Bay, a fleet of Swordfish-class submarine carriers, led by Captain Oda of the Takashio, deployed the squadron of A6J Watatsumis attached to their hulls. The IJN's 17th Tactical Armor Squadron, the Stingrays, piloted a variant of the reputable and heavily armed A6 Intruder. They were the first to emerge on the shores of Sadogashima, spearheading humanity's counterattack under a hail of depleted uranium and 120mm shells, while the submarine carriers surfaced behind them to provide supporting fire. Stingray Squadron was quickly able to secure a beachhead on which vanguard troops of the Whiskey Unit could land. TSF transport ships and LCAC units rushed across Mano Bay, braving the intense fire of Laser-class Beta. A new wave of heavy lasers had emerged from the hive and soon began firing upon the landing transports. While Stingray 1 coordinated naval fire in order to eliminate the new Beta group, Imperial Army TSFs were forced to launch under heavy fire. The carrier Takao was the first to go down, with the TSFs on board launching in a chaotic emergency sortie. Dozens of landing ships were struck by lasers and suffered the same fate as the Takao. On the shoreline, Whiskey Unit took several losses, but were able to advance the beachhead and drive back the initial press of Beta. With their landing successful, elements of their main force advanced westward, fighting their way toward the operation's planned defense line. More waves of TSFs and armor would continue onto the shores and reinforce the forward units. The 23rd Armored Division, the 133rd Tactical Armor Regiment, and the 999th Tactical Armor Battalion would fight prominently in the diversionary action. Meanwhile, the Imperial Royal Guard's 16th Battalion, under the command of Takatsugu Ikuruga, landed as a reserve force behind the now established Takase Sawane defense line. After over an hour of fighting, Whiskey had succeeded in securing their objective. A division-sized herd of Beta left the hive as predicted, moving southward to engage the Imperial forces. Losses were within expected parameters, though 81 of the landing vessels had been destroyed, including 49 TSF carriers, while 52 vessels had been damaged from the assault into Mono Bay. Upon Whiskey Unit's success and the withdrawal of the landing fleet, the next phase of the operation commenced. Echo Unit, consisting of the UN Pacific Fleet and the IJN Combined Fleet's 3rd Squadron, opened fire upon the Ryotsu coastline. Shortly after 1000 hours, the Echo landing ships rushed into the bay at maximum battle speed, covered by the combined firepower of the Musashi, the Yamato, and the American battleships. The IJN's 19th Tactical Armor Squadron, the Salamanders, fought their way onto the beaches of Ryotsu, with the task of ensuring its clearance for the Echo landing force. On board the Osumi, the Valkyrie Squadron sortied at Nap of Earth flight, joining the UN Far East forces as they landed in Ryotsu Bay. Armor and TSF units moved forward, fighting to secure an initial defense line around Lake Kamo. Amid the intense combat, the bulk of the UN forces then began diverting northwards along the coast, maneuvering to the northern tip of the island at Washizaki, where they intended to establish a second diversionary battle line. Herds of Beta emerged from the hive in pursuit, while many errant groups strayed into the kill zone on the far side of Lake Kamo. Captain Isumi and A-01, however, detached from Echo and proceeded southeast. The elite task force cut a swath through multiple Beta herds and proceeded to their first objective. They secured the ruins of Kamenibo, a narrow, mountainous valley on the island's southeast. From there, the Susano Mark II was scheduled to ingress onto the island and assume its firing position. Its escorts were required to ensure its arrival remained uncontested. After extended fighting, the Valkyries secured their objective ahead of schedule, forming a defensive position and engaging sporadic Beta groups. Meanwhile, back at Yokohama base, the Susano had finished sortie preparations. Powered by its state-of-the-art gravitational fields, the massive aeronautic fortress rose into the air over Yokohama, before vectoring northwest toward the ongoing battle. By the time it arrived near the Niigata region, Admiral Ozawa officially announced the commencement of the operation's 4th phase. By 1200 hours, the Imperial troops in Whiskey Unit had suffered 33% losses, but were holding firm. Type 90 main battle tanks and Type 87 self-propelled anti-air guns held the Takase Sawane line alongside battalions of IJA Gekishins, Kageros, and Shiranuis. With their entire force now on Sado Island, the Imperial Army units advanced away from the landing zone, moving westward to further reinforce the diversionary position. At the other end of the Kawahara coastline, Stingray Squadron established a support by fire position, raining a high volume of crossfire over the Yahara Dunes, and cutting into the flanks of the Beta attacking Whiskey Unit. Watatsumis of the IJN's 4th Tactical Armor Squadron had emerged to the southeast of the island as well, advancing inland. The 4th advanced through the ridges and secured a position at the foothills to support the flanks of both the 17th and A-01. Toward the north, Echo Unit had advanced past Matsugasaki, methodically drawing the Beta in the direction of their planned position. Having lost only 1/10 of their forces thus far, the UN troops fought fiercely, with Admiral Ozawa himself said to have been impressed by their zeal and conduct on the battlefield. Meanwhile, in low Earth orbit, the 6 Orbital Drop Corps received confirmation that their planned drop onto Sadogashima would be commencing. First Lieutenant Rena Turvo, captain of the HSST Mother Goose 1, exchanged several jokes with the 2 surface pilots she would be dropping onto the battlefield. Both were veterans participating in their 3rd drop, with one of them being Captain Henry Gietzen, commander of the Aquila Squadron. Gietzen himself had dropped at Mandalay and Lyon, both operations which ended in failure. He prepared himself for Sadogashima, knowing that his survival and victory were slim possibilities. On the surface, Whiskey and Echo had managed to consolidate their forces at their respective diversionary lines. The Beta had been drawn out of the hive by the tens of thousands, colliding with the intense gunfire and artillery bombardments of the Imperial and UN forces. With Objective 21 now primed for infiltration, the order to drop was given. For the HSST fleet in orbit, deploying re-entry shells would send dozens of manned machines hurtling down into the atmosphere, where laser fire could easily target them. Knowing full well the risks of their role, Mother Goose 1 released the capsules attached to her destroyer's hull, and Aquila 1 and 2 joined countless other TSFs as they began their orbital dive. Plummeting over Siberia at speeds over 24 kilometers an hour, while decelerating at 8.2 Gs, many first-time divers were unable to handle the strain of the descent and blacked out. Their fortified suits would act to awaken them once they cleared low Earth orbit. Despite the altitude of the orbital troops, the Beta across Asia would not target them, and many of their capsules successfully separated from their conjoining re-entry units. The capsules, each holding a single pilot, descended individually, while the detached segments accelerated ahead of the orbital divers. It was the re-entry shells that received laser fire, with their anti-laser holes erupting into clouds of heavy metal, which further covered the descent of the 6 Orbital Drop Corps. Arriving over Sadogashima, each surviving capsule released, breaking apart and shooting the debris toward the Earth. The orbital divers, now in control of their TSFs, once again confirmed their descent trajectory with one another before passing into the heavy metal cloud, where communications became disrupted. Below, the capsules and their debris crashed into the vicinity of the hive, impacting with all the force of a kinetic strike from orbit. This succeeded in wiping out thousands of Beta, as well as opening numerous entry points into the stab beneath the Earth. Exiting the heavy metal clouds, units of the 6 Orbital Drop Corps re-established local communications and regrouped on the ground amid heavy fighting. Gietzen assembled the Aquila Squadron, confirming the survival of all 12 members during the drop. Fighting their way through the Beta with impunity, the UN Strike Eagles cleared a path to the hive. Sauber Squadron was the first to push into the stab, with other units infiltrating at alternate gates and makeshift entrances. Orbital divers fought their way into the Earth for the next half hour, encountering and destroying packs of tank-class Beta deep inside the tunnels. 5 Imperial TSF battalions from Whiskey Unit broke off from the defense line, detouring around their Beta attackers and moving across the center of the island from the Yahara Dunes. These troops, bringing supply canisters and additional manpower, would join the orbital divers in the hive infiltration. Attacking aggressively, the combined infiltration force struck deep into the stab. By 1240 hours, they had cleared 11 stratums down into the surface, reaching a depth of 440 meters. At the forefront were the orbital diver Sauber, Ghost, and Razor squadrons. Behind them, spread out through multiple passageways, other orbital diver and IJA battalions, grouped Juliet through Lima, took a rearguard position and established communications and supply lines between the surface and the advanced units. Lima advanced to link up with the orbital diver units at the front, while groups Mike and November prepared to infiltrate the hive as reinforcements, entering from a separate ingress point. Sporadic resistance was encountered and wiped out, with little to no casualties sustained. The UN troops soon found themselves advancing quietly through the eerie tunnels of the stab. In spite of their quick advance, they had begun to suffer from malfunctions in wired communications. Sauber leader, still hoping to keep up the rate of advance, prepared to advance another 100 meters down. Suddenly, seismic and sonic sensors began reacting across Sadogashima at an unprecedented scale. Approximately 40,000 beta signatures began filling the tunnels below the strike force. In response, the orbital divers began coordinating their units in an attempt to link up with the rearguard element and establish a defensive line at a nearby hull junction. This proved ineffective, as records of seismic data would later confirm the first-time emergence of a new, colossal strain of beta, the carrier class. Its existence then unknown, the carrier was capable of burrowing through the earth and extending or creating new passageways in the hive. Even worse, within its interior, it was capable of carrying tens of thousands of beta and disgorging them into the passageways through its gaping maw. While the positions and movements of the hive strike force could only be approximated, it is believed that the carrier class bypassed the positions of Sauber Squadron, emerging in the tunnel above them, while thousands of beta still emerged from below. Engaged by overwhelming numbers all at once, both the orbital divers and the Imperial battalions fought a chaotic battle in the confines of the stab. Sauber, Ghost, and Razor squadrons were caught by sleeper drifts surrounding their TSFs. Juliet, Kilo, and Lima groups were forced into engaging the beta, which had emerged above the advanced force. Along with Aquila Squadron and the remaining orbital divers, the rearguard was quickly wiped out as well. Later analysis of battlefield data yielded little information as to the true nature of their engagement. All that was known was that the Hive strike force had ceased all communication with Operations HQ aboard the Mogami. The two remaining IJA battalions, Mike and November, had only begun their push into the Hive and were immediately ordered to retreat back to the Whiskey defense line. In only a few brief, haunting moments, the entirety of the 6 orbital drop corps had been annihilated. Making matters worse, several division-scale herds began emerging from the Hive, intensifying the pressure across all remaining fronts of the AO. Spreading out from multiple gates, the bulk of the beta would proceed southeast. This led their advance herds directly into the position of the Valkyries. Acting quickly, Captain Isami divided her flights between 3 different sectors and fought an aggressive defense, making short work of the first echelons of beta. As the squadron regrouped, the entirety of the UN and IJN fleets were tasked away from covering Echo and Whiskey, and instead refocused upon the large herd in the center. With the Hive infiltration force defeated, the XG-70 remained the mission's alternate method of success. Its staging position could not afford to be overrun before its arrival. Ozawa ordered the firing of the naval artillery in support of A-01. Initial impacts of the salvo damaged the massive herd, before the fusillade was suddenly intercepted by volleys of laser irradiation. A new group of 100 laser and heavy laser class had emerged from the depths of the Hive, nullifying the artillery bombardment. Only 30% of the artillery shells had broken through, causing minimal damage to the Beta approaching Kamenibo. With the threat of laser fire too close to her unit, Isumi ordered the Valkyries to take cover in the cliffs behind them. Her single squadron of Shiranuis would be unable to rush out into the dozens of heavy laser strains, while packs of destroyer and fort class were still around to defend them. The IJN began changing their shells from multi-purpose standard rounds to anti-laser munitions once more, in order to rebuild the density of the heavy metal clouds. This would keep most of their vessels unable to provide fire support for 10 minutes. Each battleship would require 2 minutes for the process. Even with a new, impenetrable network of laser fire, Ozawa at the very least intended to draw the attention of the laser strains toward the sky so as to provide A01 the chance to perform a laser yag against the herd. Isumi, however, would need to contend with and neutralize the vanguard wave of destroyers at the enemy's front. Retreating further into the cliffs, she positioned her 3 flights between the spurs of the dried ravines within the old Nebo Dam region. Estimating the time of arrival for the approaching destroyer class, and taking advantage of their poor capacity for human detection, she ordered her squadron to power down their engines and remain in hiding. Already, the Susano was crossing the Sato Straits, and clearing out the heavy lasers would be paramount in preventing it from suffering a devastating barrage of laser fire in lieu of its reported ability to withstand it. As the destroyers rushed past the Valkyries, HQ managed to signal the pilots to re-engage their engines. The Shiranuis powered on and emerged from their concealed positions. The Valkyries then engaged the Beta Vanguard from behind. As predicted, these tactics prevented the destroyers from turning around within the narrow ravine. While her flight alone remained to destroy the helpless vanguard, Isumi detached her 2 other flights to perform the laser yag. Command of this daring charge was placed in the hands of the Valkyrie's second-in-command, First Lieutenant Hayase Mitsuki. Immediately advancing against the Beta, Hayase's detachment engaged thousands of hostiles, fighting to locate a route through their ranks. In both Ryotsu and Mano Bay, vessels which had finished loading anti-laser munitions resumed their naval bombardments on the central enemy group. Laser fire was directed upwards, intercepting the falling shells and creating a renewed cloud of heavy metal. But A01 was heavily engaged by multiple fort class, which formed a natural defense for the laser and heavy laser class at the rear of the herd. With their formidable skill, the Valkyries still managed to cut down wave after wave of tank and grappler class, but remained unable to break through the large strains. Hayase, in order to secure a route, allowed for one of her surface pilots to break off from the assault group and create a diversion through the herd. Valkyrie 10 charged into the midst of the fort class, firing and cutting through the swarms of medium and large Beta. As a testament to the full potential of the XM3 operating system, the lone Shiranui was able to remain in prolonged combat against multiple fort, grappler, and tank strains assaulting it from all directions. The rest of the Valkyries, holding a defensive position outside the enemy line, were unable to provide support in order to ensure the decoy maneuver succeeded. With Valkyrie 10's sacrifice, the Beta were lured southward, encircling the cut-off TSF. This caused a route of attack to open up for Hayase's detachment, and the Valkyries rushed through to the rear lines of the Beta. They began to swiftly and efficiently eliminate numerous heavy laser class. Valkyrie 10, though surrounded and without support, was able to score over 20 confirmed kills against the Fort-class Beta, and countless victories against grappler and tanks. Captain Isami, fighting in the ruins of the Nebo ravines, finished wiping out the destroyer-class Vanguard, and immediately turned her flight around. She rushed to the northwest, personally breaking off to assist the lone Valkyrie who had provided the diversion. Then, linking up her entire squadron once more, the Valkyries proceeded to wreak havoc within enemy lines, targeting as many laser species as possible before the Susanoo's arrival. Meanwhile, at the Whiskey Unit's defense line, artillery support had been redirected to cover the A-01 task force in full. This left the embattled Imperial units without the firepower to hold back the renewed Beta assaults. Units across their front were steadily being overrun. The 133rd Regiment began suffering multiple losses, with many flights annihilated by the advancing enemy. Observing the steady collapse of the front line, Ikaruga mobilized the elite Royal Guard into action. Piloting their powerful Takamizuchis, the IRG 16th Battalion stormed onto the 133rd's position, hammering the Beta with assault cannon fire and cutting them down with the skillful use of their long blades. Rescuing what members of the 133rd they could, the Royal Guard then advanced directly into the Beta herds, adopting a formation which allowed them to encircle enemy groups with enfilading fire. Multiple units in distress required their aid, and the Royal Guard's actions succeeded in buying time for regular army tank platoons and TSF squadrons to regroup. At Echo, the fighting had also intensified. UN forces at the north took up positions in the crater of a mountain, holding their end of the line. The troops at Ryotsu used Lake Kamo as a barrier to slow the Beta advance and leave them vulnerable to direct fire. Unlike the Imperial forces at the Whiskey defense line, who now suffered over 50% casualties, the forces at Echo had only taken 37% losses. But the onslaught was unrelenting all over the island, and every unit struggled under the pressure. The only unit still on the offensive was the A-01 Special Task Force. Fighting amid thousands of Beta, the Valkyries did not relent in their precision and skill for a second. Managing to neutralize dozens of smaller laser strains and 27 heavy laser class, the Shiranuis fought down to the last minute of the Susanoo's arrival. Only 12 heavy lasers remained after an initial estimate of 100 total laser strains, and the Valkyrie squadron had suffered no losses after inflicting such damage, once again demonstrating the groundbreaking lethality of TSFs using the XM3. With the battle coming to a head, troops on all fronts hunkered down and prepared for the worst. Conventional tactics were failing, and the Hive strike force had been horribly decimated. Artillery support was being utilized to assist the Special Task Force alone, and the Beta were once again swarming out of the Hive in the thousands. But over the ruins of Nebo Dam, the Susanoo had finally entered the battlefield. We will cover the rest of the events at Sadogashima in the second part of this battle record. Make sure to subscribe in order to stay tuned. A huge shout out goes to the community on Patreon. We are steadily growing and have several unique videos being produced from their creative requests. If you would like to support the war effort, the links can be found in the description down below.